Hello, world history students. Today is Unit 5, Part 3, The Power of the Church and the Crusades. What you see there is a crown of what they called the Holy Roman Emperor. Holy Roman Emperor was basically the emperor of a Germany that never really quite got unified. Talk a little bit about that today, but mostly we're going to be talking about the structure of the church and the church itself in Europe. You might remember I told you that the Catholic Church in Western Europe was the one remaining kind of institution um, that affected all of Europe, all of Western Europe. A lot of the political unity that was going on was much smaller, but pretty much everybody who lived in Western Europe at this period of time belonged to the Catholic Church. And all of the clergy people, all of the people who are religious figures, fall under the authority of the Pope in Rome, who you might remember was claiming to have power over everyone as the successor to Jesus. And the Pope is in Rome, and he's got a bunch of bishops. Those are kind of like the managers of the church who live in various places throughout Western Europe. But most people just had contact with their local priest. Everybody who was a Catholic was going to the local church, going to Mass there, and interacting with a local priest. So once again, you have this hierarchy of Pope at the very top, and then some bishops or the managers sort of in the middle, and then at the very bottom are these priests. And these priests and bishops and Pope, but especially the priests, provided what they call sacraments to the people of Europe. Sacraments are important religious ceremonies like baptism, or the Mass, church services, or hearing people's confessions, listening to the sins that they committed, telling them what they should do in order to overcome those sins, and then telling them that Jesus had forgiven them for their sins. So the clergy is very, very important at this point in time. People believe very much in heaven and hell and miracles and all those kinds of things. And you have all of these people in Western Europe who have these shared beliefs in the teachings of the Catholic Church. It's bonding them together in a pretty turbulent time, a time when life is pretty short and oftentimes pretty nasty. People died of sickness, people died of hunger, people died in violent ways as well. And the Church offered them hope, told them that if they were good, they could be saved through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. And the village churches served as a kind of religious center. It was also the social center for people who were getting together. It's kind of the biggest building in any locality. And so they meet at least weekly to worship and to celebrate all the rituals of the Catholic Church. Now, the church's authority was both religious and political. The popes, once again claimed to have power over everyone and everything because they were the successor to Jesus. And the law of the church actually creates laws that are called canon law. And, the people were supposed to obey this canon law. Imagine that the church is creating law. It's not just a kingdom and a king creating law. You've got a church that is doing that. The Pope has at his disposal a couple of different forms of punishment if people break canon law. And people at this point in time, like I said, believe that miracles happen. They believe that the clergy have these powers to do things like take away sins or help people get into heaven. One thing that the popes claim that they could do is excommunicate people. You might remember that the Pope had excommunicated the patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Excommunicating is saying that that person no longer belongs to the church and has no hope of salvation, or in other words, they're just going to go to hell. So the Pope can, he claims, damn people to hell, and people believed it. There's also something called interdiction, which could even be more serious. With excommunication, you are getting rid of one person, or you're saying that one person is no longer, possibly saved until they change their behavior. Interdiction is what a pope would do to an entire kingdom or to a territory, where he would say to all the clergy in this place that no sacraments could be given, no sacraments could be performed by the clergy in the king's lands. This usually would, either one of these things would usually bring a king getting pretty quickly under control for as long as they believed that the Pope could do these things, that they believed that the Pope could excommunicate them, or for as long as the clergy would listen to the Pope and say that they aren't going to have religious services, the Mass, or they're not going to hear people's confessions, or they're not going to baptize babies and things like that. Popes had a lot of power in the Middle Ages. It starts to fade, though, as time goes by and people stop believing in these kinds of powers. Popes and emperors then clashed, or popes and kings clashed. There was this thing called lay investiture. That's a practice by which kings, for the most part, or maybe nobles, were appointing local clergymen or local church officials, including bishops. Now, the Pope would want to be the one to appoint all of the bishops. After all, they're his managers. But sometimes kings said, hey, it's my kingdom. I'm going to be the one to decide who a bishop is. That's what lay investiture is. The popes didn't like that at all. They wanted their bishops to be hired by them, fired by them, or whatever, so that they would listen to them rather than listening to the local king. So a power struggle between kings and popes over who gets to appoint bishops was raging in the Middle Ages. Pope Gregory VII banned this practice, lay investiture, in 1075, and excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Remember, it's kind of like a German emperor in a way. Well, Henry got scared. First of all of his nobles said, oh my gosh, you're excommunicated. We don't have to listen to you anymore. You're damned to hell. When you die, you're going to go right to hell. And so Henry said, oh my gosh, I'm losing my power. Nobody's listening to me. And maybe he even believed that he was damned to hell. So he goes to the Pope and asks for forgiveness, kind of goes to the Pope on his knees and says, please, please forgive me. And they came up with a compromise where the church would appoint bishops, but then the emperor or the kings could veto those appointments if they felt like the person who the Pope wanted to be bishop wasn't the person that they wanted to be bishop. So that compromise kind of worked out for a bit. It's not over by any means, as we'll see going forward in other units. Now, the Holy Roman Empire, like I said, is really just Germany. It's kind of Germany on steroids. It's much larger than Germany today or historical Germany. If you can see that map there, it goes into parts of Italy, goes all the way down to Rome, it goes into Eastern Europe. And so this thing called the Holy Roman Empire is a kind of pre-Germany, but much bigger than that. And it's the Holy Roman Empire was really not very unified. It's not a nation. It's not a country. It's just a patchwork of feudal territories, not well put together at all. Oftentimes, the rulers of those various territories, you see there, didn't really listen to the emperor, because oftentimes the emperors were spending all of their time and all of their money and a lot of knights fighting to invade the northern part of the Italian territories, attacking Italian cities, attacking the Pope sometimes, and the popes in these Italian cities turned against Frederick I, or the Holy Roman Emperor, and made sure that he couldn't get a whole bunch of power, or so that he couldn't really unify Germany at that point in time. And in fact, Germany won't be unified until relatively recently in history. We'll talk about that in second semester. The church had a lot of problems. There's a lot of corruption that was going on. One of the problems was that the priests were supposed to be celibate or not have any families or have any sexual relations with women, but they were married and they were having families. That was a big no-no, but nobody really seemed to care very much. They could sort of pay a fee and not have to obey the Pope or not have to obey canon law. They were also the church was engaging in something called simony, in which bishops were selling church positions like priests. They were selling the ability to be a priest to people, and the people weren't who were just buying their way into the church really weren't very religious. That was a problem. There was continued lay investiture as well, as kings still continued to try to appoint bishops and try to appoint churchmen so that they would listen to them. That was a problem that existed. And then two, the church kept butting into the business of kings by trying to enforce the canon law, trying to collect their own religious taxes called tithes from the kingdoms of all of these kings. Like I said, these problems are going to continue into second semester until we talk about something called the Reformation. Well, the Crusades are a kind of interesting and somewhat silly thing that happened from about the year 1000 to about 1400 or so. In 1093, the Byzantine Emperor, you might remember the Byzantine Empire was losing territory, mostly to the Ottoman Turks. And the Byzantine Emperor decided to ask the Pope for help. Now, this is just 40 years after the Eastern Church and Western Church had split. So it's kind of a big deal for the Byzantine Emperor to ask the Pope to send some people to encourage Western European knights to go and help defend Constantinople from the Muslim Turks. But in fact, the Pope did that. Urban II called for a holy war to go and help the Byzantines go free Constantinople from a Turkish attack, and then go farther than that, go all the way into what for Christians and quite frankly Muslims and Jews was Holy Land. They wanted these Christian knights to go and liberate the Holy Land from Muslim people who had taken it over. Now the Pope offered kind of like the reverse of excommunication to these knights who would go on this crusade. He promised anybody who goes on this crusade, anyone who goes to the Holy Land to try to get Jerusalem back for Christians, could be saved, that they would instantly go to heaven if they died while fighting for Jerusalem. And so a lot of people signed up. A lot of knights signed up, headed out towards that way, headed over to the Holy Land, several different waves. There were several different crusades, probably about 5 major crusades. So lots of people signed up, even simple people. There's even supposedly a children's crusade where a bunch of kids tried to go and liberate the Holy Land. If that actually did happen, we're not really sure. Who knows? But if it actually did happen, evidence is that they got sold into slavery by unscrupulous people rather than actually ever making it to the Holy Land. So some of the goals of the Crusades were this is the Pope sending people, so to reunite the Eastern and Western Christians, the Catholic Christians and the Orthodox Christians back together. And political too, to gain territory in the Holy Land, carve out territories, carve out little kingdoms or duchies or counties out of what is Palestine or today's Israel. They also wanted to get rid of some of the knights who weren't very chivalrous. There were lots of knights who behaved badly, lots of violent knights and so on. And this was a good place to get rid of these overly violent knights. Send them off to the Holy Land, let them fight there, let them get out their aggressions there, rather than hanging out in Europe and maybe causing trouble or causing crime. And this also was a goal of the Crusades, was to get some of these young knights to go and make their fortune. They were running out of land in Europe for the number of knights that they had due to feudalism, and maybe they could go carve out themselves some territory in the Middle East, and then maybe there could be a beginning once again, or a rebirth of trade between the East and the West. Maybe the Silk Roads could be started up again. They had kind of fallen by the wayside when Rome fell, so maybe a Silk Road could be recreated, and sure enough, that does happen. So the First and Second Crusades are successful. The Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, but it wasn't too much longer after that a very smart and good leader by the name of Saladin, a Muslim leader by the name of Saladin, was able to seize Jerusalem back from the Christians in 1187. The Third Crusade was maybe one of the more famous ones. It was led by Philip II, King of France, Frederick I, who's the Holy Roman Emperor, and Richard the Lionhearted, the King of England. They try to seize Jerusalem back, and it ends up actually in a truce with Jerusalem staying under Muslim control. But Saladin was going to allow peaceful Christian pilgrims to show up and visit Jerusalem. Later crusades failed to capture Jerusalem, so it wasn't completely successful, as I said. Really, that first one and second one were probably the biggest violent successes, but then the third one was a compromise success, I think. And then the effects of the Crusades to end today: increased travel from people who were going from Western Europe to the Middle East. It was a chance for them to see the world, and or see parts of the world, and actually get into contact with other cultures through cultural diffusion. When all these men left Europe too, it left women behind to manage things. And so women had more opportunities to look after the estates of their husbands while their husbands were away. Maybe a queen could have some power as the king of a nation or king of a kingdom went to go fight in the Middle East. This also does expand trade, as I said, with Southwest Asia. Spices and fruits and cloth, like silks, were coming from the east and going to Europe. Europeans got used to wearing silk, at least rich ones did, or the spices that they came in contact with in the Middle East. This also weakens the power of the Pope and the feudal nobility, as these crusades are not a success, so the Pope is not successful in the long term. The feudal nobility is also weakened as a lot of them die. Kings start to become more powerful in Europe, as the kings are, able to solidify power, as the popes are starting to decrease in power a little bit. As I said, it strengthened the power of kings. Lots of knights lost their lives. Of course, they lost their fortunes. And when a knight would die in the Middle East, their land would revert back to the king, and the king would be able to give that bit of land to some other person, to another knight who might listen to the king a bit better than the knight who had that land in his family for several hundred years. Finally, though, and this is a negative thing, of course, there's a legacy of bitterness and hatred between Christians and Muslims because of the Crusades. Um, the Christians didn't think that the Muslims had a religion that was true. They viewed their religion as something inspired by the devil. They thought Muhammad was inspired by the devil, and so they were there to fight. And there can only be one person in control of the Holy Land, or one side in control of the Holy Land. That's what the Crusades are kind of about. So it's sad, but a lot of people died, and then Christians and Muslims were at odds with one another. And Jews too got persecuted. When the first Crusaders showed up to Jerusalem, Jerusalem had a number of Muslims living there, but also had a number of Jews living there. And the Christian Crusaders decided to slaughter a lot of the Jewish people who lived there, sadly. Also, there were Jews living in Europe at this point in time. And before the Crusaders went to the Holy Land to try to liberate, Jerusalem from control of Muslim people, they decided that they should deal with the non-Christians who were living amongst them. So they massacred Jews before they went on these crusades, or as part of going on these crusades. It's very sad. Constantinople was weakened too. It was not really helped out. When Crusaders showed up to Constantinople, generally they sacked and pillaged Constantinople. They were invited within the walls, and then they didn't know where they were at, what they were doing, or maybe they did, but they committed a lot of crime within Constantinople, stealing things from Christian people who just happened to be from a different kind of Christianity. This weakens Constantinople, and as I said, in about 1452 or so, Constantinople falls to the Turks. Well, that should be it for today. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and please do the lecture quiz or lecture check. Thanks. Bye-bye.